If we are longing for a different type of future than the present we are experiencing, and I suspect everyone in this room is. So the first story I want to share comes from a mother in Des Moines who is also a teacher in the Des Moines Public Schools, and she shared this story with me.
Yeah, I'm gonna read it again.
You're welcome. I was so relieved when my second grader came home after her school's Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration. I worried about what she'd be taught. Like, I figured they might sugarcoat things. But when she came home, she was so excited about everything she'd learned, and her school had done a great job. But then, after sharing all she'd learned, my daughter turned to me and she said, "You know what, Mom? I'm so glad we're white." Yeah. And I thought, oh my God, do we say that?
Yeah!
So let's imagine this child had been Latina, and she had come home after school one day celebrating a Latina justice leader, and she had said, "Mom, I'm so glad we're Latinas." I think it's safe to say her mother's first response would not have been an angst-ridden, "Oh no," right? And very likely, Black children in that actual second grade class did go home and say things like, "I'm so glad we're Black." To which I can imagine many a father might have said, "Indeed, we are glad we're Black." But the racial landscape is fundamentally different when it comes to white kids. And here's the difference. If you are committed to equity, if you value justice, but you are living in an unjust society that also privileges you in that injustice, you face some very real conundrums. Conundrums that show up in a moment like, "I'm so glad we're white, Mom." Oh my God, do we say that? And the reality is that these kind of conundrums impact white children's development from their very earliest days. Now, race impacts all of our children's development, we know that, and all children need support to navigate a society that is on the one hand justly diverse, but is also deeply, deeply, deeply racially unjust. But we also know that parents of children of color tend to offer and support their children in that work. We know from lots of studies that parents of children of color teach their kids explicitly about the ways that race matters in their lives at rates 2 to 5 times higher than do white parents. And in contrast, we know from studies that 75% of white families with kindergartners never or almost never talk about race with ours. So that is a lot of white silence, and that's what I want to talk about this morning. I want to talk a little bit about what white silence looks like. I want to talk a little bit about what's so dangerous, what it yields, and then most importantly, I want to talk about some counter responses, some muscles and practices and habits that we've got to build if we want a different future. Did any of you see this story? I think it was spring of 2018, spring of 2017, about the 2 4-year-old boys who were best friends. One of them was Black. If you saw the story, they got matching haircuts, and they were trying to see if they could trick their teacher to see if she could tell them apart. So the story was really sweet because this 4-year-old friendship was really just beautiful, and it got lots of attention for that reason. I think it kind of tapped into a longing some of us have. But I came to think, as the story just became like media wildfire, that it also got so much attention because it seemed to endorse white silence as a good strategy for raising kids. The story seemed to many of us to be proof that kids can be taught not to see color, but we know, of course, that those words are a version of what we sort of so-called color blindness, which I am strongly start calling white silence instead, because color blindness is not something that communities of color do typically. This is a white thing. White people practice white silence, and we call it color blindness. So here's another version of white silence. White silence looks a lot of different ways. It can show up in some deceptive ways. Here's another version of it from a different mom. This mom said to me, I've always to treat everyone with kindness, and they have friends of lots of different races and from different cultures. They never cared what race though until they came home after Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, families in America fits, because we don't know what to do when our kids come home and now they're talking about race. Then suddenly my kids were talking about people's race all the time, and they were saying things like, our friend Joe, he's black, right? And I really don't think it's good for them to focus on people's race and put them in boxes. Isn't that the opposite of what we should be trying to do? So this mom actually values diversity. She says up front, it's good. My kids have friends of lots of different races, and she values that. But she's also afraid that teaching children to notice race is going to backfire. And in some ways, it might. It's true, because more conundrums do pop up here. Like, what does it even mean to say that Joe is black? Does Joe identify that way? And what are her kids assuming now they know about Joe because he's black? And yes, making assumptions about anyone because of their racial identity is part of what we maybe learned not to do during the civil rights era. And obviously it's a problem. Children, but especially white children, are running around labeling other children. So there's lots of conundrums, it's true. But even if it backfires because of those challenges, if this mom succumbs to the temptation to avoid those risks by responding with white silence instead, the backfire will be much, much, much more severe. If she defaults to generic teachings like, love everyone the same, or underneath our skin we're all human, or everybody's equal, we all bleed red blood, it will backfire worse. And it's not at all just about white kids. Because what adults, white adults in particular, are and are not able to say to children about race and anti-racism actually has everything to do with where the white adult is. Okay? Where we are in our own abilities. So it's not about white kids. And also, finally, it's not just about white kids. Because white silence impacts kids of color, and then teenagers, and then college students, and 20-somethings, and pre-professionals, and colleagues who come into contact and have to deal with white kids, and then white teenagers, and white college students, and 20-somethings, and pre-professionals, and white colleagues. So this is a conversation for all of us, because white silence and the way it socializes white young people impacts everybody. And we're all involved in the work of figuring out how we shift that. So why is white silence so dangerous? I want to give two examples, one having to do with young, that sort of is the teenager version. So we know from the amount that this has been studied is just incredible, and so that we aren't further along in having more strategies says a lot about what we care about, because we know all the data is in. Children internalize racist perceptions of themselves and of others by the ages of 3 and 4. Not just white children, all children. And by the ages of 5, children recognize that different racial groups are treated differently, and they understand something about racial social status, all 5-year-olds. And so now think about that data I gave you. 75% of white families aren't talking about race with their kindergartners. That's age 5. Those kids already know a lot about racial social status. And the other thing that we know that kids know by age 5 is that they're not supposed to talk about this in front of adults. So there was a study of preschoolers that was done that found over and over again that kids, if they thought the teachers were not watching, would play, all kids, not just white kids, would play with larger social messages about race. And these are messages that many adults, we just assume go right over children's heads. And so here's just one example that really stood out for me to this powerful study. And all the language here is the researcher's, not mine. But she writes, the researcher wrote, there was a white girl pulling 2 other girls, one white, one Asian, in a wagon. The wagon gets stuck and the Asian girl jumps out to help. The white girl responds, no, you can't pull this wagon. Only white Americans can pull this wagon. Renee has her hands on her hips and frowns at Ling Mei. The Asian girl tries again to lift the handle of the wagon, and Renee again insists that only white Americans are permitted to do this task. So this is a 4-year-olds using very sophisticated white racial assumptions about who is American or not in their play. This was long before 2016. So we might be tempted right now to be thinking something like this. Well, oh my gosh, what are they teaching that child at home? You can, if you want to confess it. I probably thought, I would have thought that too. I was a really, really, really good parent before I actually had kids. I used to blame everything on bad parenting, and now I'm like, oh no. But truly, we need to resist that answer. That could be what's going on at home, but actually that could very well not be what's going on at home, because that's not how this works. Adults often explain racist displays in kids by assuming that there's a few rogue, bad adult apples. We've heard that language in other places, haven't we? But that's not what this is. We've got to understand that racism is smog. And that is Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum's language, not mine. We are all breathing in smog every single day. And so if the problem is smog, then white silence is just as likely to manifest in that wagon example as is family members at home saying only white Americans can be citizens. Because white silence is basically the decision to send your kid out in the world without a breathing mask while there's chemical warfare being waged in the air they're breathing in. Go on without a breathing mask. And so our 4-year-olds, our 5-year-olds and on, they just breathe it right in and they breathe it right back out. Racist perceptions of others, and for white kids, false internalized notions of their own superiority. And most of the time, white adults don't even know this is going on. But that's what smog does. And I know smog is that powerful because, for lots of reasons, but my children have 2 moms. Neither of us is particularly gender conforming. We're also not silent about sexism in our home, and I could tell you many stories about my kids saying sexist things at home. My favoriteest nightmare ever was when my now 10-year-old, but at the time 4-year-old child proudly, she was wandering around the house all the time talking about God, and she kept saying, well, he this, and he that, and he this. And I'm a religious studies professor, and I'm a big old feminist. And so finally, one day I was like, okay, I said, H, how do you know that God is a he? And she goes, well, God is a boy's name, Mama. Oh, well, yes, obviously it's a boy's name, right? God is a boy's name. She knew it was Hebrew, I didn't know. But then, I kid you not, I can picture it, we're standing in the kitchen, she was standing on her little, learning tower thing, and she looked at me and she goes, anyway, Mama, God has to be a boy. Boys are better than girls. Right? Now imagine if she'd said that out in the world. They'd be like, well, what are those 2 lesbians teaching that little girl at home? Well, no, that's not what's going on at home. We even put breathing masks on, and that's how powerful smog is. Okay? Another reason silence is so dangerous is that our kids notice everything. Developmentally, that's what they're doing. They're interpreting what they see. So who's here in this space? Who's not in this space? Who's doing what work? Who's in charge? Who is almost never in charge? And when we live in a deeply segregated and completely hierarchical society, that alone has its own impact. Adults don't even need to help those conclusions along. When our kids don't see African American people in leadership roles, they just decide, oh, well, Black people must not be leaders. When they see Latino people primarily in service or custodial work, if that's all they see, oh, Latino people must not be able to be teachers. They aren't doctors. Again, adults, we don't even realize this is happening. All we need is white silence, and the culture will help our kids, and their developmental processes will help these interpretations along. So here's a teenager description of what white silence yields, and this is also from another deep qualitative study. The preschool study was a year-long deep dive into preschoolers. This is a year-long deep dive into the world of high schoolers. And Mary Buchholz, this researcher, spent a year in a very multiracial high school in Northern California, where the curriculum was committed to multiculturalism. So this was not a place trying to do white silence. They were trying to do the celebrate diversity kind of model. And she interviewed kids of all racial and ethnic identities in the school. And so she did repeated interviews. And each interview that she began, she started by asking students their age, their sex, gender, their grade, and their race, ethnicity. And something very students could not answer the last part of that question. So they were fine when it was age, sex, grade, but when the race part came in, they just started squirming. Students of color in the school did not have this problem. They would just answer. So the white students, though, they would just start squirming. And so some of them she describes give really ironic answers. She gives the example of one boy that she's talking to. She said he abruptly takes on a fake British accent when he has to answer the race part of the question. And he goes, "Well, I'm the whitest of the white boys." She was like, okay, that was really awkward, But he's kind of mock celebrating his whiteness. It's a squirm. And then other students would play ignorant, or they'd get really uncomfortable. So they would say things like this: "Well, I'm white. No, you know what? I'm Dutch. That's right. I remember now. My great-great-grandmother was Dutch. That's right, I'm Dutch." Or they would go, "I'm white, I guess." So she pushes on this. Buchholz discovers two things. One is that these young people are literally not sure. They literally don't know if saying I'm white is the same thing as saying I'm racist. And they know they don't want to be this. And the other thing is that they associate whiteness, and this is all of the young people in the school, it's not just the white kids, they associate whiteness with, quote, cultural blandness and a lack of coolness. And sometimes this is sort of joked about by the young people that she's talking to, but other times it's clearly evident to her that it's quite painful. And just this little basic demographic question raises all this stuff for our young people. And so this is really, really important. Because imagine you're at an age where being uncool is about the worst thing that you can be. I'm sure you have to imagine it because you've probably never experienced that, right? It's a stretch. But you're in a context where you're being told that celebrating diversity is what we do, where you're supposed to, it's a key value, right? That's the context of this high school. But everybody knows that you aren't really supposed to celebrate your diversity, or is it that? You're right? But none of the adults are helping you with that. And so the equation is this: you cannot embrace your race. Everyone else gets to embrace theirs. And you're supposed to enjoy embracing your much cooler peers' difference all the while. What do we think is going to happen when we set all up in that kind of equation? So Buchholz discovers what happens. She discovers lots of those white young people are really, really resentful and kind of pissed off. So what they resent, though, is they don't resent and they're not mad at the adults in their lives, the white adults who have not supported and mentored them in anti-racist anything. Where do they turn their hostility? You can say it. That's right. They turn their hostility on their peers of color. And then they turn their hostility on this whole diversity thing, right? This is not a defense of white youth. I'm not making that case. This is a call to responsibility to white adults who are letting this happen. Because last year on Drake's campus, where I teach in Des Moines, Iowa, and this happened on campuses across the country, I had a student, an African-American student I work with, texted me at 5 in the morning, and his text said, "Harvey, oh my God, these flyers are all over campus." And he had a picture, and it said, "It's okay to be white." And these had been flyered all over our campus. And the reason, and this happened all over the country last year, it's going to happen again, I guarantee you, and then between now and 2020, there are forces in this nation who know that that vortex is there, and they are recruiting. And I believed this before 2016, but now I'm seeing it on my college campus. So we've got to get serious about breaking silence. We've got to do it now with urgency and passion and commitment in sustained ways. And I see this, it's a long-term work, it's a generational work, but it's also urgent. We've got to start we needed to start, but if we haven't started, we've got to start now. And our institutions, our churches could be powerful on this front if we decided to make it a priority, because our young people, all of our young people, need us to address that vortex in this work of diversity and anti-racism. Okay, really these kind of forums, we are needing to create the strategy. So I've got some ideas, but we've got more to figure out. The first is that we need to create race and justice conscious schemas. We've got to create race and justice conscious schemas. And I'll give you an analogy here. So as I said, my kids have 2 moms. So basically that means my kids have always just known that you could have 2 moms. They just think that's normal. Even before they knew what a mom was. Their experience was have multiples of them. And so when they go out in the world and dominant culture says to them over and over again, 2 girls can't get married, or you have to have a mom and a dad, my kids just think those messages are strange. For my kids, the messages like that they encounter, those are outliers that have to be explained. It never occurs to my kids to think that they're the outliers who have to be explained. And that's what a schema does. It's the deepest, it starts in even prelingual ways. The deepest patterns our children developmentally build about what is normal, right? And so it's a powerful defense for my kids that their original schema is just that you can have as many moms as you have. So we've got to do that with talking about race and racism and anti-racism with all children, but families of color are already usually doing this. We've got to do this with white kids too. So there's a lot of ways to do that. Early and often race talk is essential, from the earliest moments, the moments our children come out of the womb. Talking about race and difference. It's also essential that young children learn what racism is. If we want our kids to develop anti-racist ways of being in the world, they can't even begin to have that moral imagination if they don't know what racism is, right? And so we can't wait till they're 15 to explain it. We start when they're prelingual. And most importantly, from the moment they draw breath, we also need to talk about and model for them and take them to places where people are resisting racism. So that my kids, my biggest goal as a parent is for them to think anti-racist action when you encounter racism is the most normal thing you would possibly do if you're a human being. I want that to be their schema. I want them to know people are always resisting racism, that people have always resisted it, and I want them to see themselves as part of that community. White silence waits for perfect words. We wait until our kids are ready, whatever the heck that means. And then we try to explain racism, and we're so far behind in white families. And so then we've got to just also then deconstruct the colorblind schema and the schema where they think you're not supposed to talk about it. We got to do all this stuff, right? There's a reason 19-year-old students at Drake, when I get a class of students, white students, some of them have a hard time believing their peers when they talk about police brutality. It's not that they're just jerks, maybe they are jerks. It's literally that for 17 years, all they ever heard was, well, everybody's equal. So they literally can't take in that police violence, police contact with black and brown people is a normal part of the experience of black and brown communities in the United States of America. So there's all this, they're so far behind. So we got to make it normal. Schemas, justice, race and justice conscious schemas. The second thing we have to do is realize that race are powerful. When I say scripts, I mean like a play, like we write a play. So I've been in so many spaces where white parents will talk about having put our children, that's our value, and then ended up very disappointed when our kids could not sustain friendships across racial lines. And one of the things that we've got to understand and come to terms with and help our communities understand is that whatever our unique and commitments and identities. All of our lives are unfolding in a larger racial story. And this story began every single day, and often in ways that we would choose against, but it's being written that way anyway. And so what that means is that I've been handed a role. And it doesn't matter if I like the role. It doesn't matter who I am. It doesn't matter that in the 90s, I did anti-police brutality organizing in New York City. It doesn't matter that I did that. The day after another African-American person is killed by police officers and that footage goes viral on the street in Des Moines, and I encounter an African-American citizen of Des Moines, I'm just another white person if that person doesn't know me, and maybe even if they do know me. Because all of that violence and trauma and that woundedness, it mediates our relationship. It's in the air between us. And actually, in many of our lives, it prevents us from ever going beyond a first encounter. That's what scripts do. They put us in roles whether we like it or not. And racial scripts are about our collective relationships, and they function in our children's lives too. And that's what adults who are caring for and mentoring the next generation, we've got to help our young people understand this, and we've got to teach white kids to interrupt the scripts. So they're not immune. If I only ever teach my daughter that police are safe, if that is the only talk I ever give my white daughter, her relationship with her black cousin, who is necessarily being taught that police are complicated for him, their relationship's going to erode and be impacted. They can cousin love each other all they want right now at ages 10 and 13. In 2 to 3 years, the depth and authenticity of that relationship will corrode and erode. That is how the script will play out. Here's a funny story about racial scripts, especially for those of us that have educational roles in kids, in the lives of children. I think thinking strategically, okay, so how do we interrupt these scripts is really, really important work, and it's sometimes difficult. So I offer this example. My nephew, T, attends a very racially diverse school in Des Moines, part of Des Moines Public Schools. And he is now 9, but when he was 5, he is a very, very, very bold and hilarious young person, child. He is the kind of child that can brilliantly name the elephant in the room that none of the adults want to name, and make everybody uncomfortable with, and he does it, but also laugh at the same time, he's brilliant. And when he was about 5, we were having family dinner, and he was telling us all about having played dodgeball at school that day. And he announced to the adults this. He said, "We're not supposed to say black kids against the white kids." Oh, he's black, by the way. I don't know if I said that. And we all started laughing really hard because we knew that meant he had done that. But then we asked him, "Do you know why your teachers don't want you to do that?" And he was like, "Nope, they just said, don't say that." So, the fact that there was in the mix some developmental naivete going on with that invitation to play racially divided dodgeball. But I also suspect there was an emerging kid awareness of racial tension in the school. He was playing with it. And I was really sad that the teachers hadn't felt equipped to lean in and explore that with those 5-year-olds, because the silence that they put instead means those 5-year-olds are more likely to succumb to the racial scripts. Those kids are going to figure out a way to square off as black and white in some other way, if not in dodgeball, some other way. They've been handed roles, and by age 5, they were starting to know it. I know that's why T said that. So instead, I was trying to imagine that day, any number of responses, with love, I was trying to imagine, okay, what could have a teacher done instead? Instead of saying, "Don't say that." Well, what about well, that's an interesting idea. What made you think of that? Or, well, what about white kids and black kids who are friends? Would they be allowed to play on each other's teams? Or, but how do we know who's black and who's white? What about kids who have families who are black? What about students who are Latino or who are from Vietnam? Do they get to play? And what team are you going to put them on? Or, that's interesting. Where else do you see people divided up and going against each other like that? Does that happen in Des Moines where we live? Does that ever happen in our school? I am confident that especially that last line of questioning would have potentially elicited amazing, important information for those teachers about what's going on in the school. So I want to be really clear that I am not suggesting children be allowed to play racially divided dodgeball. That is not my takeaway. Don't tweet that if you tweet. But I am very, this is a great example of prime opportunities that come our way all the time to do race and justice conscious dialogue with young people in our lives. But what it takes is adults to stop underestimating our children and also to stop freaking out. Okay, 2 more stories. My third story is about race being in our bodies. So we were at Chuck E. Cheese when my younger was about 4. And there was it was really, really, really crowded because for some reason these folks had their party on a Sunday afternoon. Oh my God. And the crowd in Chuck E. Cheese was the very, very crowded crowd. It was mostly white. But there was also a large group of young African-American kids running around that enjoying themselves immensely. And nothing was ever explicitly stated during the entire couple of hours we were there, but it was within moments that I could feel in my body the racial dynamics in the space. So I noticed things like the white adults were giving quick glances towards these kiddos. They weren't like explicitly hostile glances, but they definitely had a vibe. And I noticed that there was a very pronounced physical avoidance of the kids in the space. And it was especially strange because the space was so crowded. And so we were all needing to negotiate our bodies in space. And so like if 12 of us tried to walk through that door right there at the same time, the first way we're going to negotiate that with our bodies is actually to make eye contact and kind of do things like this and show regard through our body postures and our eye contact. That was not happening. And so like an African-American kid would bump into a white adult and the white adult would they would just sort of pretend it didn't happen. There was no acknowledgement happening, no eye contact. It was like we're all in these racial bubbles and it was really awful. So at one point, this was long before I was writing Raising White Kids, and so I didn't have any analysis of this. I've tried to kind of use some theories later to understand what happened, but what was going on. But at one point, just as I stepped up to help my 4-year-old with a game, a boy who was probably about 9, who was part of this group of kids, they stepped up to play at exactly the same moment. And consistent with the vibe in the space, he didn't look at us, and we were going to have to figure out who was going to go first. And this child happened to have these just incredible designs shaved into his hair. And I stopped him and I said, "Hey, I love your haircut." And he turned and looked at me, and for a moment he looked a little bit startled, and then he broke into a huge smile and said, "Well, thanks," because he obviously also loved his really gorgeous haircut. And then we all made eye contact and smiled, and we played the game. I don't remember who went first, and it was, all fine. And then what happened was, for the next hour, about 2 or 3 of the kids he was in a group with, they chased my child E around Chuck E. Cheese for an hour. And what they did is they kept coming up to my child over, shoving tickets in E's hands every time they won a game. Like hundreds of tickets. I think Emery went home with E went home with 900 and some tickets turned in for landfill plastic that day. And it was so sweet because Emery, I'm trying not to say my kids' names in public. E was 4, and E was just beaming because these were 9-year-olds, So in E's life, this was older kids just showering my child with love and generosity. I mean, she was beside herself. And the entire hour, that was the only interracial interaction I saw in Chuck E. Cheese. The only one. So I don't know for sure. My hypothesis, as I really tried to wrestle with this later, was that, in some ways racial divides, in this case the unexpected crossing of one, had a lot to do with what was going on in that interaction. For my part, I can only speak to my part with certainty. My part, I felt the relief of not having stayed inside the racial bubbles that were actually totally at work that day at Chuck E. Cheese. I don't know what this child experienced, and it's very dangerous to talk about anyone else's experience, of course, and especially a child who isn't here to speak for himself. But I do feel clear that, you know, his smile and then the exuberance that with which he engaged my child over the next hour meant that something welcome had happened in his experience. I mean, I don't know what most 9-year-olds who would give up Chuck E. Cheese tickets. After Terrence Cruncher and Keith Scott Lamont had been killed in Tulsa and Charlotte, they'd been killed by police, and students at my institution were organizing a protest, a vigil, and I said to my kids, who at the time were 6 and 8, you remember when we were talking about the men who were killed by police? And I said, you know, my students are organizing a protest, and I'm going, and if you want to come with me, I'll take you with me, if you want to go. And so they both said, yes, we want to go. Can we make signs? And I said, sure. What are your signs going to say? And both of my kids said, Black Lives Matter. And I said, okay, yes, you can make those signs. So I've taken my kids to protests their entire lives, even before they knew why we were there. And they, by that year, 6 and 8, they were old enough to be more understanding of what was actually going on, to be more fully engaged. We went and they were chanting and participating. And so we spent, you know, about an hour just physically present with Black people and Latino people and Asian American people and other people of color, and a few white people who were just standing together to say, no, enough, basta. And my kids then saw these young people being so brave and loud and determined about not only the value of their own lives, but about their right to be free. And my kids experienced those same young people and all these adults asking them about their signs and affirming them for lifting up their voices. And that was powerful and important for my kids' development and their sense of anti-racist agency, that they know that they can speak. And so that was how the story ended that day. But the middle part of the story is where I learned what it means to let my white children's hearts get broken. Because what happened was I went downstairs to tell them it was time to go, where they were making their signs. And when I walked into the room and I saw my 8-year-old sign, I literally lost my breath, because my kid's sign it was in green and red marker, and it had hearts and stars all over it. And she had written, big letters, Black Lives Matter, M-A-T-E-R. And then she'd written, they matter the same as white. Stop killing them. Sorry. Below that, my child had written the names of Black people of people in her life who she loves. And her sign said it like this: people that are Black are, and she'd listed their names. T, her cousin; A, her cousin; Toby, her aunt, my sister-in-law. And I'm sure you can imagine I didn't just lose my breath. I literally felt my heart shatter into about 1 million pieces, which is a moment where my child actually put me in touch again with my own humanity. Because what I remembered is that these are not days in which any of us dare live without a broken heart, because if our hearts aren't broken, we're lost. Because we've lost our humanity so deeply. But what I'm also holding on to from that devastating but so gorgeous of a sign is that at that point, my 8-year-old and now my 10-year-old was and still is a whole and wonderful and smart and kind and a beautiful and very happy child. She doesn't wake up in despair every day, but she does wake up clear. And at age 8, she was already in her not quite old enough to get it way, she was living with a broken heart. And she was too young to realize that it's like a little bit awkward to put that on a sign like that. But that's what it was. She was naming her heartbreak. And my partner and I had never said to her in a 1 + 1 = 2 kind of way, okay, H, your aunt and your cousins are Black, and so police violence actually also puts their lives in danger. We hadn't been that explicit in those ways, by that point, but by that fall, she'd already put the pieces together for herself because she was so surrounded by race and justice conscious community, not just parents, but a whole community. And so she already knew that racism is real, it has real consequences for real people, and she knows that some of her most beloveds are among those people. So she knew exactly what the stakes were, and her heart was and still is exposed enough that she just said that out loud. And so there's so much uncharted territory here when it comes to raising white kids for anti-racism, and so much uncharted territory because it's a work that most of us have not had done to us. Someone said to me last week, "Oh my gosh, I realized when I was reading this book I need to re-raise myself." We've had very few models, and it's really scary and it's really hard. But here's what I'm really clear about. The most truthful questions about how we raise white kids are not exactly how we map and measure it just right. That's going to be too slow and it's too uncertain. The most truthful questions are not the practical ones, about having the exact correct curriculum. That matters and we need those things. Too slow, too uncertain. The most truthful question is simply whether or not we'll be brave and decide to do it. We've just got to do it. And so that's the question, will we be brave? Raising white kids for racial justice requires us to expose them to hard realities. The same hard realities that kids of color are exposed to every single day. It requires us to find ways and create spaces for them to move into their own relationship with injustice, to actually feel it, touch it, and ache from its costs. And that's hard. I get it, because in part it's hard because it means we have to let white kids' hearts get broken. And sometimes we have to be the person that helps cause the break by refusing to let them stay innocent. But I am convinced that that's the most life-affirming choice that we can make, because it's the only way white kids who will become white teenagers and adults remain human enough that they actually recognize, identify with, and will fight for the humanity of their fellow humans whose lives are actually at stake in this system. And so with all the uncertainty and the awkward and the fears and the tears, we have got to be courageous. We've got to be emboldened, and we've got to be together because we need to figure this out together. It's a collective work, and the lives and the humanity of all of our children on this precious earth deserve nothing less.